China deleted an entire empire from the history books, and what they were hiding will completely change how you see the South China Sea conflict. Picture this. A massive Chinese treasure ship arrives at a tropical island. The captain, who commands fleets that dwarf anything Europe has ever seen, bows before local rulers, not the other way around. This isn't fantasy. This happened repeatedly for over 1,000 years, and China desperately tried to erase it from history. What you're about to discover will completely change everything you thought you knew about Asian history. Because while your history books focused on the Silk Road, they conveniently left out the most powerful trade route in medieval history, one controlled not by China, not by India, but by a scattered collection of island kingdoms that would eventually become the Philippines. Today, we're exposing a secret that empires tried to bury. Stay with me, because this rabbit hole goes deeper than you can imagine. In 1987, fishermen off the coast of Butuan in the Philippines made a discovery that would shake the foundations of Asian history. They found ancient boats, not just any boats, but massive Balangay ships, buried in the mud, perfectly preserved for over 1,000 years. When archaeologists carbon dated these vessels, they were stunned. The oldest ships were from 320 AD, but here's what really shocked them. The construction technique was so advanced that it predated similar Chinese and Arab shipbuilding methods by centuries. These weren't just fishing boats. They were ocean-going marvels built by a master maritime culture. But the boats were just the beginning. If this part of history already blew your mind, hit that like button, share your reaction in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on bell notifications so you don't miss what's next. Now, let's talk about the gold that rewrote history. In the 1970s, workers digging in Laguna province uncovered something extraordinary. The Laguna Copperplate inscription. This thin sheet of copper, dated to 900 AD, contained writing in a mix of Old Malay, Sanskrit, and Old Javanese. When scholars finally translated it, they discovered something incredible. It was a legal document, a debt forgiveness notice that mentioned multiple kingdoms, trade agreements, and a sophisticated legal system. This wasn't some primitive society. This was a complex, interconnected network of kingdoms engaged in international commerce. And then came the Surigao treasure, over 1,000 pounds of gold artifacts, including the famous golden Agasan image, depicting a figure that scholars believe represents a local deity or ruler. The craftsmanship rivaled anything found in mainland Asia. All this evidence paints a picture of a vibrant, wealthy, and highly advanced civilization. But here's the question nobody could answer. If the Philippines are so advanced, why don't our history books talk about it? Why does every Asian history course focus on China, India, and Japan, while treating the Philippines as if it was a backwater that only became important when Magellan arrived in 1521? The answer is chilling, because powerful empires spent centuries trying to erase this history. They say, geography is destiny. Well, look at a map of Asia. Really look at it. The Philippines sits at the absolute crossroads of everything. To the north, you have China, Korea, and Japan. To the west, India and the Middle East, via the Malay Peninsula. To the south, the Spice Islands of Indonesia. And to the east, the vast Pacific. But here's the crucial part everyone misses. In the age of sailing ships, you couldn't just sail in a straight line. You had to follow the monsoon winds and ocean currents. And those currents, they all passed through Philippine waters. The northeast monsoon brought Chinese and Japanese ships south. The southwest monsoon carried Indian and Arab traders east. The Philippines wasn't just along the route, it was the route. The master of this maritime highway, between 900 and 1500 AD. The Philippines wasn't a single kingdom. It was a network of dozens of powerful city-states called Cadetuans. And this is where the story gets fascinating. Take the Rajanat of Butuan in northeastern Mindanao. It controlled access to the Pacific. Their Balangay ships were the finest in Asia. Chinese Song Dynasty records called them consummate shipbuilders. These vessels could carry 90 tons of cargo and travel thousands of miles without stopping. Then there was Maitay, likely on the island of Mindanao. Chinese records from 972 AD describe Maitay as a major trading power. Chinese merchants would arrive with porcelain, silk, and bronze. They'd leave with Philippine gold, pearls, cotton, and exotic woods. But here's the key detail. The Chinese had to trade on Philippine terms, not their own. Up in the Manila Bay area, the kingdoms of Tondo and Namayan controlled the entrance to the Pasig River system, the highway into Luzon's interior. Nothing moved north or south without going through them. And in the south, the Sultanate of Sulu controlled the sea lanes. They were the gatekeepers between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Everyone forgets what made these kingdoms so powerful wasn't just location. It was what they controlled: gold. The Philippines had some of the richest gold deposits in Asia. Spanish conquistadors would later write that they saw more gold in the Philippines than in Mexico or Peru. So where did it all go? Chinese records show massive gold imports from Luzon. Then there were pearls. Philippine pearls were legendary. They appeared in Chinese imperial courts and Middle Eastern palaces. And let's not forget the exotic goods: beeswax, cotton, civet musk, birds, nests, medicinal plants, and hardwoods, items that Chinese and Arab elites would pay fortunes for. But the ultimate commodity these kingdoms controlled was information. Because everyone passed through, Philippine traders knew prices in China, India, Arabia, and Java. They knew which goods were scarce and where. They were the information brokers of medieval Asia. Here's where it gets really interesting. Chinese records from the Song and Ming dynasties are filled with references to Philippine kingdoms, but there's something odd about them. The Chinese always describe themselves as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, superior to all others. Yet, when they wrote about the Philippines, the tone was different, respectful, almost cautious. Why? Because Chinese merchants needed the Philippines more than the Philippines needed China. A Chinese text from 1225 AD describes trade with and I quote, "The Chinese merchants must follow the customs of Miai. The local rulers set the prices. The Chinese do not dare to cheat them. For the people of Mai are skilled in trade and know the value of Chinese goods better than the Chinese themselves." Read that again. The Chinese didn't dare cheat Filipino traders because the Filipinos knew Chinese markets better than the Chinese did. This system worked too well. The Philippine kingdoms developed what historians now call a prestige goods system. They didn't mass-produce cheap items. They focused on high-value, rare goods that couldn't be found elsewhere. This created perpetual demand. Chinese emperors wanted Philippine gold. Japanese nobles wanted Philippine pearls. Indian merchants wanted exotic woods. And here's the genius part. The Philippine kingdoms never became dependent on any single trading partner. If China imposed unfair terms, they'd trade more with Arabs. If Arabs tried to monopolize routes, they'd strengthen ties with Java or Japan. This multi-directional trade network made them virtually impossible to conquer economically. So why did China try to hide the truth? When the Ming dynasty came to power in 1368, they faced a problem. They had just overthrown Mongol rule and needed to restore Han Chinese pride. The narrative had to be clear. China is the center of civilization. All other nations are tributaries, subordinate states that depend on Chinese favor. But the Philippine kingdoms didn't fit this narrative. They weren't tributaries. They were independent trading powers that dealt with China as equals, sometimes from a position of strength. So, Ming historians did something subtle but devastating. They began rewriting the records. Philippine kingdoms were described as tribute-bearing states, even though the trade was mutual and beneficial to both sides. The language changed from trade partners to barbarians seeking Chinese civilization. But archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations in the Philippines have found Chinese porcelain, yes, but also Arabian glass, Indian beads, and Vietnamese ceramics. These weren't gifts from a benevolent empire. This was international commerce. Then the Spanish arrived in 1521, and they were confused. They expected to find primitive villages. Instead, they found fortified cities, literate rulers, and sophisticated legal systems. Miguel López de Legazpi, who led the Spanish conquest, wrote in 1565, "These islands are more populous and richer than we imagined. The natives possess much gold and engage in trade with China, Japan, and other nations. They have laws and write in their own script." But here's what's crucial. The Spanish had a vested interest in portraying the pre-colonial Philippines as primitive. Why? because it justified their conquests and conversion efforts. If the Philippines was already civilized and wealthy, what was the moral justification for colonization? So, Spanish chronicles emphasized the aspects they could civilize, like religion and governance, while downplaying the commercial sophistication they encountered. This flawed history was then cemented when Western universities began studying Asian history in the 19th and 20th centuries. They relied heavily on Chinese and Spanish sources, both of which had reasons to minimize Philippine importance. The narrative became, China was the center, India contributed culture, and Southeast Asia was just a passive recipient of both. The Philippines got reduced to a footnote, discovered by Magellan, colonized by Spain, unimportant until the Americans arrived. The truth is, for over 1,000 years, a network of powerful Filipino kingdoms stood at the center of global trade, connecting East and West. They were master shipbuilders, shrewd traders, and the gatekeepers of the world's most important maritime route. This isn't just about correcting a history book. It's about understanding that the world has always been more interconnected than we're led to believe, and that powerful nations have always tried to control the story. Thanks for watching. If you want to keep exploring hidden histories, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. We'll see you in the next one.